As I move towards Colt, portions of that sphere begin to engulf his body, and as more of him is inside of that sphere, I can hit more of him, right? Does that make sense? So if I can't hit his hips at this range, I have to do one of two things in order to hit those hips. I need to either put more of him in my sphere by moving closer, or I need to shift my sphere down by bending at my back. So it's kind of hard because usually when people bend, they also move forward. But remember, the center point of that sphere is just this shoulder, right? So if I kind of squat down a little bit, now I can hit him in the shoulder. But I can't hit him, I can hit him like right here, right? Because that sphere has changed its space. Well, that's fucking fine and dandy, Tato. What the fuck do I do with that? When you start using your sphere of range and you think about it in these techniques and in these kinds of perspectives, what it allows you to do is say, if he is going to bend over to hit me, why would he do that to hit me in the chest? The answer is he wouldn't. He's going to hit you in the hips, right? So it gives you kind of an obvious tell. And the other thing that it does is it lets you figure out, well, where do I need to be blocking and where don't I need to be blocking? So if you're at that max reach, I don't need to be blocking well. A lot of people like to teach this stance because those hip shots are so common because everyone starts out fighting like this. You don't need to do that. If I'm coming at him and he's in that hip guard, I can't reach his hips until after I can reach his shoulders, right? Because that's just what the sphere tends to engulf as it comes in, right? Why would he want to keep his hand there first? Because I can throw either to this side or this side, and I can't hit those hips, right? So if he's going to start down, he's going to start down in a position that I cannot strike until I've gotten through here, right? Then why would I do that at all? You know what I mean? Why not just stand up here at the first thing that I can reach, and then you have 50% of your options covered so long as you maintain that range. That makes sense. That's why my hand is so high when I fight, because I want him to go this way. But we'll get more into that kind of thing later. But as long as you understand that sphere structure, that allows you to kind of understand your own range, understand your opponent's range, and understand what targets are viable as people start coming closer. Does that make sense? Now the subsection of the sphere of range is the cone of attack, right? That is, it has to do with, I haven't figured out like a mathematical representation for that yet. However, it is the space that his body occupies within that sphere connected to my shoulder, right? And it's more important to consider, in my opinion, your opponent's cone of attack than your own, because it gives you a little more information about what he's trying to do, but it's something you need to be able to visualize. So as he comes into my sphere, right, that cone of attack forms, and the center point is on my shoulder. The outside edges of that cone are the outside edges of his body, right? So the point of this cone is here, and the sides of this cone connect to my shoulder, right? So you have one here, this is one length of it, and this is another length of it. Why is that the cone of attack? Why does that matter? That's the space that he has to bring his sword back into in order to hit me. So if his sword leaves the cone of attack and doesn't come back in, by definition he can't hit me, right? So he's not coming back to the cone. And I know that sounds a little silly. Why would you imagine that? It tells you where to put your hand. There are no fancy blocks for weird-ass shots. You do not have to find a different block for every shot and memorize them all in some sort of weird, bizarre Pokemon list. Like all of these shots have to re-enter this cone, right? So that's why we use that house guard, which I'll define a little bit later. But for now, I want to show you the top two portions of it, and I will show you the merits of an extended defense, or rather putting your hand into that cone. So you guys know what a cone is, right? Shaped like that. So we're going to do this way, because I'm not fighting, I can use my arm. So if he's right here, we're going to start with that classic Tux Guard. And I want you guys to think about where my hand is, right, when I'm blocking this shot, if my hand is close to my body. So that blocks that shot, right? You see where my hand is in relation to my body? Right here. So you kind of want to just print screen that position. So if he goes to the other side of the cone, my hand is staying close to my body. That'll give me a block, right? So here and here. right? If my hand is far down this cone, see how that's off my body? That shit's blocked, right? Go to the other side. See where my hand is? See how that popped off? See the difference there or here? What would you rather do? The easy one, right? That's why we keep our hand out. There's a slight exception to that rule in terms of reps, which I'll define in like the next little section of combat geometry and shit. But that's what you need to know about moving your hand forward into that cone. So what does this do? If I have my hand right here, as Colt starts coming in, 50% of what he can hit is already blocked, and it forces him to go to the other side, and he cannot reach this, right? So if I don't know what he's going to do, and I have limited him to the top 2 quadrants, I didn't really go over the quadrants, but it's pretty simple. I have a 50% chance of being right. I can close my eyes, you know what I mean, and figure out like what's going to go on. Use that kind of like, there's 2 ways he can go. There's 2 guards that I need to use. I could be right half the time if I limited him to those 2 and cover one really well, and then all you need to do is switch. In addition, if he fakes me out, he fakes me this way, right, and goes the other way, it's really easy to still make that block by moving an inch than it is to go from here to here. In my opinion, when someone starts coming here, that's when it's go time. That's when you want to fake on them and then crush them and then swing again until they're in the fucking dirt, because they're not going to recover. They're back here. You can fucking crush them pretty easily if they do that. That makes sense. The merits of an extended defense. That makes sense why you would do that from a physical standpoint. I know a lot of people like these kinds of blocks, but they have the same problems. It's just you have to move much, much further, and it's much less efficient. And it's efficient to fucking kill shit, right? The military is always coming up with more efficient guns that can reload faster, shoot farther, shoot straighter. Simpler stuff. Creativity is great for offense. Creativity is not so good for defense. That makes sense. Okay, so the 4 blocks that you use, the first block, according to the people that were trying to teach block strike in my area for the top quadrant, is apparently this. But the real first block, well, first we'll define the quadrant system. Y-axis, X-axis, quadrant 1, 2, 3, and 4. You only need 4 blocks. You might need 2 more blocks if you insist on blocking your legs, but if you think about your legs, that is the absolute last thing that enters into the sphere, right? That's the last thing you can reach. If you're maintaining that sphere appropriately, the legs should never even really be an option. And that's why grinding is such a smart idea, is because if me and Colt are fighting from right here, everything is an option, especially Colt's head if he keeps stabbing me while I'm talking. Right? Everything is an option, so this isn't a smart place to fight from. But if we keep each other out, there's less options, so it's more of a chess game then instead of the first guy to fighting wins. Anyway, quadrant system, right? This is, I always call this the house guard because it makes the most sense, and I need
2 more swords.
I need 3 people to stand up with swords and come here because I love this. So I'm the mighty Tato. Imagine my quadrant system right here, right? If we're fighting and I'm trying to block the top sword side quadrant, my block is here, correct? So what you're going to do is hold my sword right here in space and then give me your sword. So hold it from the pommel and stand on this side.
Don't move the blade.
Okay, so we're imagining that my hand is staying here. From this position, if I want to block this side, I turn like that, right? Hold this here at the pommel, stand here, give me your sword. If I move from this top guard down to guard this hip, I drop down like this, right? So hold this here. If I move from here to guard this hip, I move down like this, give me your sword. Okay. Well, don't give me your sword, keep that. Well, let's talk about these points though, right? So the first thing you notice, this is moved just a tiny bit. The best position to guard your sword with is closer to your hand. So you have it in the middle here. Anything you try to block with above this point, it's just going to flip out, right? So no one's strong enough to stop a shot with just this rotational part of the wrist. So you'll notice actually where this tends to cross is right at this efficient point of blocking. I prefer to block here, but you can usually catch things up here. So you notice how those are crossed up there based on the distance between these swords. That's part of it. You'll also notice that it's kind of the same down here. Swords are all different lengths. And then that's the hip guard. That's the other hip guard. So one problem that can occur is when people try to block a top quadrant shot like this. So if Ursius fucks this up, well, what happens if it rains? Your roof's open, right? So these are the 4 guards that you use. House style guard. That makes sense. And when combat geometry thing is the triangular plane of the sword, and this is kind of an esoteric concept, but I think that it's worth at least knowing about, and it has to do with the wraps and how they leave that cone and then re-enter that cone, right? So you want to envision this triangular plane as being a point from here to here to here, shaped like a triangle, right? So if I'm wrapping outside a Colt, he's perfectly in this cone, right? He's right along it. But by leaving it and re-entering it a little deeper, I can actually hit. And you'll notice if I chop right here, that won't hit him. But by raising my hand and leaving the cone and then coming back into it with a wrap, it actually still hits. Well, what does that mean for the first Tucson defense? Is you actually have to sink back into the cone a little bit, but not by pulling your hand back. You want to do it with your shoulders. Because what this does is, this actually changes the shape of the cone a little bit. Keep it straight, it'll work. Trust me. It changes the shape of the cone a little bit and recesses that shoulder back into it, and it kind of stresses it out. But basically, if you think someone's wrapping, you got to learn to recess back into that cone a little bit, just using that shoulder rotation. And some other neat concepts. Well, I always call it torso rotation. I don't like to pivot around on my legs. I'm too stacked for that nonsense. Twist. That makes sense. Okay, the last mathematical concept that you want to talk about is it's a little more complex, but they're primary, secondary, and tertiary returns, right? And what this has to do with, and this is more block striking, we're going to get into some block strike. We're going to start right on right. After you throw, there are returns to your body, or ripostes, or counters. There's a primary one, a secondary one, and many tertiary ones. So tertiary is a broader category. Primary and secondary are usually one shot, or at least one path. People will do it funky, but they'll still go to that region. And it has to do with your hand height and position on the end of your shot. So if I throw low on Colt's hand, like this, notice I am swinging for this quadrant, and you have to pretend that I thought that that was going to hit him at some point, because that's kind of a stupid shot. If I throw this way, the primary return is going to be to this forearm, right? Because that's the easiest thing to see. So the qualities for a primary return, when I try to list them verbally, is typically it's the fastest one, and it does not cross the plane of the sword, because that requires more effort and more motion. So from the same shot, the secondary return is going to be there, right? And most people, especially if I'm closer on his hand, will try to come around and under the sword a bit. But he's still got the basic premise. It's going to be to this side, right? So it's got to cross that plane of the sword. And you'll notice that it depends primarily on my hand position on the end of the shot, not what I'm throwing at. We're going to talk about 2 different shots. So, primary return for if I throw a flat rep to his chest, like this, primary return here is going to be over here. Why? Because this arm and hand are up high, so it's going to be a little harder to hit, right? If I throw at his chest with kind of a backhand, like this, the primary and secondary returns switch, right? He can hit this chest if he tries to flat wrap around it, but that has to cross the plane of the sword. So the open spot is over here. Does that make more sense? I don't teach people too much of offense in terms of when this happens, do this. When this happens, do this. Because I think that your offense is a creative endeavor, and I think that that's important for people to have their creativity in terms of offense, because that makes it a lot less predictable. But defense, in my opinion, is purely scientific because it's based on these shapes, right? So what I want you guys to think about is when you're thinking about your primary and secondary returns, you want to kind of categorize every shot that you throw to say, okay, the easiest thing for them to hit me with is this side. And secondarily, I might have to block this shit. But what this means is, when Curtis throws a high cross on me, the first thing that he wants to do, if his hand is covering this zone, the primary return is going to be that chest, right? He wants to move there immediately without waiting for me to do anything else, without waiting for any kind of indication that I'm going to throw anywhere else. He just wants to build into his muscle memory that after this, then that. The secondary return, that's what he is watching for to happen, right? That's what he wants to see happening. The primary return, he's just going to cover it and he's going to look for that secondary return. So he's going to block the one that he knows, and he's looking for the second one to come, right? Or if I throw his back, he wants to come. Well, don't worry about getting it. That makes sense. So that's how you use your primary and secondary return. After every shot, think about where they'll go. Go to the primary and watch for the secondary to come. The tertiary returns are more like, they're the lower, loopier stuff. And after a lot of experience, these guards, they just cover it. And we already talked about how that sphere of range, it tells you when they're probably going to throw tertiary shots. So tertiary shots are usually lower, they're usually loopier, and they're usually longer. So after a lot of experience, you should typically just be able to see them coming, especially when someone dives at you, you know, like that. You shouldn't be thinking, he might high cross. You know what I mean? That's probably not going to happen. So that's how this works. So those are all those basic concepts that I feel that people should know before they start to work with the dojo a lot and work on a lot of the analysis and the discussion, because these are the springboard by which you want to start killing people. You know what I mean? You can use these concepts like primary and secondary returns to kill more people. You can use the concept of the cone to get other shots in. You can use the concept of the sphere to figure out where you want to be in space as you're fighting. So use these basic tenets as your canvas to paint a picture of beautiful fighting whack and beat downs.